There's a kind of a shorthand that's emerged in the social sciences in which micro means things like
closer to the individual.
Closer to the individual, and macro means things that...
Right, more systemic and
like
structural.
Bourdieu or Durkheim would have called social facts that
right.
are beyond any individual consciousness. And I think that needs to be rethought, but I'm just not sure
well, that's very interesting. It's a very interesting point to me, because it is a way that I'm inclined to think, because I'm interested in looking for micro foundations
right.
for large-scale outcomes. But that really presupposes that you can make a distinction between high-level claims mm-hmm. and more local claims.
Well, micro foundations, insofar as it reduces down to or moves us down to the level of an individual calculus, I think does map onto my sense of one of the key ontological distinctions within the human sciences that I do take to be a real existing distinction, which is between processes internal to the psyche and interrelational social phenomena that are not reducible to complicated relations within an individual psyche. I mean, in some sense, I follow here, as I've told you before, I've been very influenced by some of the thinking in critical realism, and one of the distinctions made there is between psychology and the social sciences. The critical realists don't really like the idea of sociology as a distinct science from political science, from anthropology, etc., mm-hmm. economics, but they do seem to, at least some of them, believe that there's an ontological distinction to be made between individuals and social structures, and intra-individual phenomena are the reasons that they want to distinguish. So psychology, or the psychic sciences more broadly, seem to have a different ontological basis than social phenomena, mm-hmm. fundamentally different. Social phenomena seem to be emergent from psychic ones, and non-reducible to them, have an emergent set of properties, but to be based in them as well.
Right.
And so micro-foundations, to me, might mean something like specifying these underlying mechanisms from which social phenomena are emergent and are non-reducible to
right.
them, whereas micro-foundations explanations in rational choice theory and game theory often seem to want to reduce what I'm calling social relational down to this prior ontological level of the psychic.
Right. And the third possibility is the one that I favor, which is that we look at the individual as psychologically complex, but also socially complex from the start. Mm-hmm. So the individual is socially constituted,
yeah.
and the individual is in a concrete set of social relationships already, mm-hmm. but they're all proximate. Mm-hmm. So that's what I refer to as methodological localism.
I see.
And then to offer a micro-foundational account is to show how some high-level claim, like the state compels people to pay their taxes, mm-hmm. how that disaggregates onto a set of institutions of encouragement and enforcement, mm-hmm. which finally make it to the proximate relations among individuals.
I see.
And there, I guess I do think it's you can make a kind of an understandable distinction between the claim the state extracts taxes, that's mm-hmm. a macro claim, mm-hmm. and the mechanisms through which taxes or conscription or other forms of compliance mm-hmm. are elicited.
I see.
That's the kind of disaggregation into local institutions which govern behavior or induce behavior.
Local institutions and ultimately down to the level of individuals.
Right. Mm-hmm. With the idea that institutions themselves are manifest in the behaviors and the socially embodied expectations and beliefs and preferences mm-hmm. of individuals. That's what mm-hmm. it is to be socially constituted. Mm-hmm. So you're playing a role within the tax system mm-hmm. when you have an inclination to pay your own taxes, mm-hmm. you have disapproval of other people, mm-hmm. you see the incentive, 10% rebate if you turn in your tax evading neighbor, mm-hmm. and for all of those reasons you are compliant within the system of taxation.
Okay.
So you, in other words, help to constitute the institution of taxation through your own mm-hmm. socially constituted behaviors. That's kind of the idea.
I think this is a part of the interview where the camera should be turned around on you, Dan, because you have a much better understanding of these issues than I do.
Well, you used the word realist a minute ago, and that actually was another concept I wanted to follow up with you.
Okay.
I think you are inclined to identify yourself as a realist or maybe a critical realist.
Yeah, some sort of realist.
Maybe you could just explain what that means.
Well, at the most basic level, I guess realist means that there are social mechanisms as well as natural ones that exist independently of our theories about them. Mm-hmm. And that's a kind of a base level realism for me. And then a critical realism is one that has, what's most interesting for me about critical realism is not necessarily its theories about the natural sciences, although some of the conclusions they draw for the social sciences are predicated on an understanding of the natural sciences, so they are a precondition for that, but more on the kind of specific, the definition of what's different and what's not different between the human sciences and the natural sciences. Mm-hmm. So really going back to the old question of Windelband and Rickert at the end of the 19th and early 20th centuries, but answering them in new ways. And 4 or 5 things, according to critical realism, help us distinguish between the natural and the human sciences. And these can be specified as aspects of the way that mechanisms in the human sciences operate. First of all, they're relational, and this is the part of realism that I think Tilly, for example, embraced in his so-called relational realism. But in addition to being relational, they're concept-dependent. Mechanisms are dependent on the meanings people attribute to them. And I think this is an aspect of mechanisms in my version of realism and the critical realist version more broadly that is not necessarily present in the relational realism approach, or at least it was underplayed. And what this really goes back to is the distinction that already Windelband and others in the late 19th century were drawing between human action and the natural sciences in their emphasis on the need for an interpretive approach to understand the meaning that actors attribute to the practices that they're engaged in or the objects with which they're interacting makes all the difference in the world. This is sort of a premise of all interpretive social science. A wink is not always a wink, sometimes it's a blink, and so on and so forth, as Geert said. Thirdly, mechanisms are often time-dependent in the sense that they're not universally extendable across human history. They're specific to a specific historical period. Fourthly, they're often place-dependent. They're often specific to a particular geographical space or place. So many of the critiques of the extension of Euro-American conceptual sciences to non-Western societies are premised on the idea that there possibly is a fundamentally different set of mechanisms driving practice or human action in non-Western societies, or at least the possibility needs to be entertained. I guess those 4 are really the key. And so critical realism allows you to keep all those together. And then because of its analysis of the natural science experiment and the conditions of possibility for experimentation in the natural sciences, it's already dealt with the problem of general theory, because even in the natural sciences, the experiment is predicated on the idea of holding constant all of the mechanisms that aren't the mechanisms of interest. That very holding constant through experimental closure and so on suggests already that even the natural world is a so-called open system. It's a system in which multiple mechanisms are generally operating and combining to produce events, objects, things that we see in the natural world. And in order for natural science to narrow down and bracket all of those things that aren't of interest, it needs to produce artificial closure. Now, that kind of artificial closure is more or less impossible in the human sciences. It's almost impossible to bracket every single mechanism that's not of interest and produce an experiment. And for that reason, that's another reason why we primarily work historically and not experimentally. Experiments are, for the most part, impossible. When we talk about experiments in the human sciences, usually what's going on is an experiment on a natural mechanism. For example, in much of psychology, which is located at least at, for example, this university in the social sciences division, there are experiments, but the experiments that are true experiments are usually operating with mechanisms that are natural mechanisms. And there's an attempt to close off through laboratory conditions of all the other intervening or disturbing mechanisms.